normally when I did my master's thesis on Leviticus, and so I'll say more about that in a minute. But normally when I talk about Leviticus, I get one of three reactions. It's either this like, oh, this is how the world should be. Leviticus is the rule book. Leviticus has this ideal society. We could just turn the clock back, everything would be perfect. And based on your shocked faces, I don't think that's everything kind of Leviticus at all. The other one is like, this is boring. I tried reading the Bible in a year, and then I got to Leviticus and decided I couldn't read the Bible in a year. Or like, I read Genesis and Exodus, and then I just skip ahead to the Jesus parts, because Leviticus is the brick wall. The third one I hear sometimes is like, well, but we're Christians, we don't need Leviticus. Like, we have Jesus, they have Leviticus, we can just part company and let them keep Leviticus. Any of these resonate for you? Well, before we start, why don't you take like 5 minutes and grab a neighbor and share your own experience with Leviticus? What have you heard? What do you know? Which of these three schools of thought are you in? We'll kind of get that out in the open first. So take 5 minutes, chat with somebody near you, and then we'll regroup. Take about 1 minute and wrap up the thoughts. All right. Yeah, that's okay.
That's good.
Anything anybody wants to share about Leviticus before we get started? Just kind of get it out in the room.
Irrelevant.
Boring, irrelevant.
Sometimes harmful or using.
Sometimes hurtful. Yeah. Yeah, so my own journey with Leviticus is back in 2019, I was starting to tour seminaries and was pretty committed that I was going to go. And then someone asked me, like, well, have you ever read the whole Bible? I was like, well, no. And they're like, well, what did you do? I'm like, well, they're like the big parts, I did confirmation, but I'm like, Leviticus, I like know nothing about. And I kind of had this thought of, I'm gay, I know Leviticus is often used against gay people. I want to make sure I know what I'm signing on for. So I took this online class called Blood, Guts, and Fire, the Gospel according to Leviticus. It's 12 hours long, you pay what you can listen to it on your phone, and it was just great. Like I remember listening to it at work and being totally captivated. I'm like, one, it confirmed I wanted to go to seminary. And two, I just fell in love with Leviticus. So then I went to Iowa for seminary, and I had a great Old Testament professor, Dr. George. I took Old Testament with him and a class on Deuteronomy and a class on current events in the Bible. And I asked him if he would be my master's thesis reader, that I wanted to do something with Leviticus. Did I just go out?
Yeah.
I just went out.
I'm taking back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's it. Okay, did that.
Yeah, that's it. It's very clear. It says right there, it's in battery. Yeah, let me go get you some new batteries. It's pretty good. Here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I started working at the state board of Leviticus, but at the same time, I was doing my clinical pastoral education for CPE, which is part of seminary. You go to a secular site and kind of learn how you apply your theology outside of the church. And I did my part review. And the season I was at Harvard was 6 months in 2022. There were a lot of dead kids. There's a lot of teens who died by suicide, a lot of shootings, a lot of car accidents. And every time I sat with a parent, I heard some version of this question: how will anything ever be good again? And I'm having these conversations at the same time I'm working on this Leviticus paper. And I'm like, this is basically the question Leviticus is asking. How can anything ever be good again? So then I really loved it. I didn't wind up finishing the master's thesis, but now you get to see a PowerPoint of everything I've done that make it in there. Before we start, I'll just like fully own some of the problems Leviticus has. For one, if you ask 10 people what something means in Leviticus, you'll get 10 different answers. Like for example, you probably know that Leviticus has this ban on pork and shellfish. And nobody's really clear on why. A lot of people think maybe this is just ancient food cooking standards, like pork will make you really sick if it's undercooked. Shellfish will make you really sick if it's undercooked. Maybe that's what we're getting at here, is like, these are hard things to cook in the desert, so let's not cook them in the desert. Other scholars wonder if these foods are like somehow associated with the neighbors of the Israelites. That the Canaanites eat a lot of lobster, so the Israelites weren't going to eat lobster. Which there's some sort of cultic, like, we do this, you do that, this keeps us separate. The opposite, right? Other people point out that like fish are supposed to swim, not crawl. And animals are supposed to chew cud, and pigs don't. So are these just animals that don't act like animals are supposed to act, and somehow they're forbidden? And like the list just goes on, that nobody really agrees on what is the definitive answer of what does Leviticus mean on this thing. Which makes it really fun to stand in front of a group of people and be like, this is what Leviticus means. The other problem is it's just super boring. Like, even in prepping the PowerPoint, I knew what I was looking for. I'm like, God, this is dense. So I will never try to persuade you to go read Leviticus. But I think it makes an interesting conversation partner for some of the things Leviticus is concerned with that we might still be concerned with today. And then as we named, it's often the one that's quoted at private raids against LGBTQ folks. And some really conservative stuff together women, because a lot of Leviticus talks about menstruation. And people will quote Leviticus on menstruation too, it's the healthcare text. So it's a hard, Danielle and I were talking, it's like the cousin that you have to love because they show up in their family. And you kind of find them fun after they get a few racist jokes out, but they're still just a hard cousin to love. That's kind of how I feel about Leviticus. Questions so far? Okay. So there's a little Leviticus 101, just like what is Leviticus? Because you're reading the Bible, you go through Genesis and get all these creation stories and all the stories about the early families of Israel. Then you get the Israelites in slavery, then they're out of slavery. And as they're wandering in the wilderness, the story gets interrupted with Leviticus before resuming again in the book of Numbers. So it kind of pops out of nowhere and then it's not again. And the traditional answer is that it's this handbook for the cultic religious life of the ancient Israelites in the wilderness. The first half addresses what priests do, the second half addresses how everyone in Israel is to live. And that's kind of what the traditional answer is. If you were to just Google what is Leviticus, this is what we'll pop up. The academic answer is that the religious life described in Leviticus probably never existed, at least not as Leviticus imagines it. But it's a romanticized version of what this cultic tradition was, and not exactly how it was practiced. Part of the argument is Leviticus is very unspecific. So for a how-to book, it has very little how. For example, when it talks about sacrificing a bull, all it says is, you should sacrifice a bull. And that's the totality of the instructions, as if bull sacrificing is something that's easy to do. You would also think that like if this had deep religious significance, there would be like a use this tool, stand here, face this direction. It would have more meaning to it. Where Leviticus is like, just go sacrifice the bull. Next question. So this gives people thinking that probably what we're talking here is more in the realm of theology than in the realm of actual history or actual instructions of something. And so then the what's and the whys become way more interesting to Leviticus than the hows and systemic things. So most likely we think it's probably an exilic text written while Israel is in exile after they've been destroyed by the Babylonians. Imagining what a more pure past could have looked like as kind of a reflection of like, oh, if we'd done it that way, it would have been better. And this makes it really fascinating because it means it's a group of people who have been conquered and marginalized, imagining how they could live more spiritual lives. And I think that's something that like we all have some interest in of what would a more spiritual life look like? And on this side of my pain, how do I wish I would have known something differently before? And Leviticus wrestles with this over and over again through different lenses. So this is just another way to think about it, that ignore the times. I stole this off of someone's blog, and I'm like, I have no idea what timeline they've constructed here, but I liked the headings. So the traditional answer would be it pops up in the wilderness journey, but probably it happens about 500 years later during the exile. So I'm going to have 7 things to present to you, and it's going to be really fast. So before I do that, check in with your neighbor. One thing you've learned so far, and one question you hope we answer tonight. Take about 5 minutes. Go for that. I think the timeline with Judaism and Leviticus is interesting. Because you kind of have this imagined past of Leviticus, and then you have like the first temple of Judaism, second temple of Judaism, and then post-temple Judaism. And I'd imagine all of them have had different relationships to what it is, trying to imagine how are we going to use this and apply it. And even the Christian church also looks at it like, how do we use this and apply it? And then over time, we kind of find our own way of doing it without talking of it in terms of Leviticus. But yeah, no, I think each Jewish sect would take a different take on it, like every different scholar takes a different take on it. And probably across the timeline of Judaism, it's also meant different things at different times. I think a stereotype is like, oh, Jews are just trying to follow Leviticus to the letter. And I think that's a blatant stereotype, that it's, we don't quite understand Judaism always, and so we just like, oh, it must be a Leviticus thing we don't understand, which isn't fair to Leviticus or Judaism. But I think it's a very common Protestant defense that's been around for a long time. Yeah, Jeremy.
How do we see Leviticus as a reaction to Babylonian?
Sure, that's a good question. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I think that's definitely happening. That they're probably looking around and like, oh, Babylonians do some weird stuff. Let's make a rule against that. Yeah. Well, so just to kind of set us on a track for tonight, I'm not going to go verse by verse or try to convince you that you should read Leviticus. I'm also not going to cover every controversy in Leviticus because there's probably a lot I don't know anything about. And even some of the ones I know about, I'm like, well, that's just boring and not going to sell anybody on it. So I'm going to stick to 7 big ideas and be a really bird's eye view of some overarching themes in Leviticus that you might pick up and find interesting, should you decide to read Leviticus. So first is this idea of Vayikra. Say Vayikra with me. Vayikra. Vayikra. Yeah, it does not. This is, it's Hebrew. It's the first word in Leviticus. And if you were to read, the Jewish Torah names the books after the first word. So Christians call the book Leviticus. Jews call the book Vayikra. That's exciting. So this is back to the first verse of the Leviticus. But the Lord called out to Moses and spoke to him at the tent of meeting. There's so much like packed into this one sentence. It's really exciting. Vayikra, you start with this idea that the Lord calls out. So that God speaks to God's people. He waves sometimes too. And then you get this idea of the tent of meeting, which is unique to Leviticus. Across the Exodus and Numbers stories of the Jews wandering in the wilderness, you hear about the tabernacle being this tent that they construct, and this is where worship takes place. And Leviticus will tell them to put it at the center of the encampment, and all of them will live around the tabernacle so that the holiest space is inside the middle of this encampment. The tent of meeting shows up in Leviticus as this separate tent on the outside of the encampment for Moses to go meet with God. And I think this is really fascinating. Has anyone ever had the sentiment of like, I really feel close to God in nature? Is that something you've thought before? I think that's a little what Leviticus gets at here. Of like, sometimes to really hear God, you have to be outside of your normal spaces. That there's an intentionality of going away to hear God. That God is always calling out, and you have to be in a place, in a headspace, and a time to really be open to hearing it. Not that God doesn't call out to people when they're in the middle of their own encampment, but that there's something about having a practice to go away and hearing God at a particular space in a different way that's really useful. And that's where Leviticus starts. The next big idea in Leviticus is the priests. So the Hebrew word here is Cohen. Say Cohen. If you've ever known a Jewish person with the last name Cohen, it's the same name. And this is the tribe of Aaron. So being a priest in Israel is a birthright. You are born into it. Specifically, if you're a man, you're born into it. But it's not a job that you choose. It's something that you were born to do. And this is the view of the priestly office in Leviticus. It is true, Leviticus is really consolidating a lot of power to the priests, which might be why I like it a little bit. But the model they present is that the priest is going to model to Israel how to live, and then Israel will model to all other nations how they should live. Kind of a concentric circle of this is what it means to live a holy spiritual life, which is a little similar to Martin Luther's priesthood of all believers. That whatever you're doing, you're modeling that to the world, that you are loving God and loving your neighbor by what you do. Whether that, Luther writes, if you're going to bake bread, you should bake bread to the glory of God and for the love of your neighbor. And if you're married, your marriage should glorify God and love your neighbor. That whatever you do should be modeling a way to live to the world around you, which is how Leviticus sees the priests functioning in this ancient temple cult. Questions so far? I told you I was going to talk fast. I was really banking on it so I could get through all this. Oh, we got Mary Alice joining us. Okay, the big thing people probably know about Leviticus is sacrifices. This is the 5th verse of Leviticus, so you don't get 5 sentences into the thing before you start sacrificing. And this is where I think context is really interesting to think about. Because we know there were ancient traditions where when you were traveling in a foreign land, you would go and make a sacrifice to that deity. So a really great example of this is in Ephesus, they used to have the Temple of Artemis. And we know that people would go to the Temple of Artemis when they passed through Ephesus to make sacrifices to Artemis so they would be safe while in this land. This was just a really common ancient schema that if you need safety, you go to the temple, you make the sacrifice, you have God's protection. So Leviticus deviates from this in a couple of ways. For one, they're commanded to make no sacrifices to any other gods other than their God. So if you're traveling in a foreign land or you're exiled in a foreign land, you're forbidden from making sacrifices to those gods. But there's a deep fidelity to this tradition. Then the reasons for sacrificing deviate too, that these aren't sacrifices for protection, but there's for things like gratitude or well-being, or because you feel guilty or you are guilty. This is an area where scholars don't totally agree. Most scholars agree there are at least 3 sacrifices in Leviticus. Some see 5, some see 7, a handful see more than 7. But it gets a little blurry of which bull is being sacrificed for which purpose and what sacrifice goes where. So the 3 that people pretty much agree on are gratitude, well-being, and guilt or forgiveness. Beyond that, it's a little controversial on what the sacrifices are for. But there's a spectrum there between gratitude and guilt that I think is really interesting. That it's not just God protect me, that I have something to celebrate, or there's something I did wrong. It's a totally like different relationship of when you would approach the divine other than just God protect me. The sacrificial system is also really egalitarian in Leviticus, that it has this over and over again cadence of if you can afford to sacrifice an animal, sacrifice an animal. But if you can't afford an animal, sacrifice a bird. And if you can't afford a bird, sacrifice some grain. Which makes it open to everybody, that there's no class discrimination going on. No, Leviticus certainly doesn't have like a statement of all are welcome, but it seems to be on that trajectory. Like we've removed some barriers to entry here that allow people to enter into this system and partake in it. And then we don't really know how common children's sacrifice was in the world. The scholarly world kind of debates it, whether it was super common or rare. There's definitely some things in the Bible about child sacrifice that forbid it, and Leviticus forbids it. So if it was practiced, it's interesting that they name specifically that children who have no rights have rights within Leviticus. I think, again, not that this is the same as a welcome statement, but it feels a little like the trajectory of having an open table for communion, that all can be welcome. Wherever you're at, there's a way to approach the table and be part of what's happening, which would be really revolutionary in a world that only does sacrifice when God, I need something, please protect me. Questions on that? Okay, this is where it gets weird. So right. There's only one real narrative in the book of Leviticus. There's these stories where Moses is walking to the tent and then back from the tent and God's talking. But otherwise, the only story takes place in chapter 10 of the book, a little bit of 9 and then continues in 10. Up to that point, Moses has been learning what the sacrifices are and how to do them and what they're for. Then he basically mantles Aaron and his sons to be the priests. Aaron's sons immediately rush into the tabernacle, into the Holy of Holies, where they're told not to go. They offer a sacrifice of strange fire. The fire kills them. And Moses basically turns to Aaron and is like, we need to bury your sons, but you can't grieve them because they did this really unholy thing. And then it moves on, and God's basically like, did you not understand me? I'm going to teach you how to do the sacrifices over again because you screwed it up. So it's an odd, strange, and disturbing story. It's also one that gets weaponized a little bit. Sometimes people will, I found one article that basically was like, any church that's run by a woman is offering unholy fire. That's what this is about. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Unholy fire, yes. Unholy. A lot of scholars have made the case that this is also arguing for a difference from neighboring cultures, that perhaps the Canaanites always offered unholy fire, and that they did something that blurred the boundary between them and the Canaanites, and that's why it's here. I see something different here. I think the crux of the story is Moses telling Aaron not to grieve. Because have you ever lost someone and kind of gotten this subtle message to like not grieve too loudly? I think about when I started at Harborview, they used to say, don't give people tissues when they're crying, because it kind of sends this message of, oh, that's ugly, could you clean that up and get rid of it? Or I had a friend one time, my dad had died, and about 6 months later, I brought him up, and he's like, wow, you're still stuck on that? And at Harborview, I would see this a lot, especially when people had died by suicide or drug overdose or something that was kind of embarrassing. There was sort of the sentiment of like, oh, we can't grieve this, can we? Like someone even asked me one time, this was a suicide, am I allowed to plan a funeral? So I think over and over again throughout history, we've sent people messages of like, oh, you can't grieve this. And it's funny that Moses says that, but God doesn't. That God's line is this, through those who are near me, I will show myself holy, and before all the people, I will be glorified. I think it's interesting to think that if Aaron is now the priest who's going to model it after his sons were killed doing this job, he starts this whole job and this whole tradition from a place of grief. And that's what he models going forward. And somehow that's for the glory of God. And I feel like that's a little of the unholy fire, is that it's, oh, this isn't what we expected, but we actually really need this grief to be part of our tradition and part of how we show God to the world. Questions on that? Okay. The biggest thing from Leviticus is atonement. And if you were to bring it up to your Jewish friends, they would even talk about, oh, that's the book with the atonement in it. As cool Bible trivia, the liturgy for the Day of Atonement is the 16th chapter of Leviticus, which is the middle of Leviticus. And Leviticus is also the middle of the Jewish Torah, which makes this the exact middle of the Torah. And it's probably not unintentional that Leviticus keeps saying, put the holiest thing in the middle of your life, that this becomes the middle of the whole book. So everything's pointing back to atonement as the center of the tradition. Richard Rohr came up with this kind of catchy at-one-mint idea back in the 90s that atonement is all about how do broken things become one again. And if you read through the liturgy, which this actually is not the most boring chapter of Leviticus, you see some themes of how atonement works here. For one, it's communal. So there's this idea that any sins that have been committed in the community should be confessed by all the community. I think about this a little bit like Pastor Katie's sermon on gun violence a few weeks ago, that if gun violence is happening, that's because we live in a society that's allowed gun violence to happen. That there's this sense that we all bear some of the guilt for whatever's going on around us because we haven't built a better world to take better care of each other. It's also routine. The Day of Atonement's Yom Kippur, which was about 2 weeks ago in October. The Jewish calendar has 10 months to it that follows the lunar cycle. And so this year was October 12th. But there's something about having a routine day that we're going to reflect together as a community at a set time every year that makes it a priority. It's also ritualized, that there's special clothes for the Day of Atonement, there's special jewelry for the priest, there's special sacrifices and incense and all the things. Everything's done a little bit differently on the Day of Atonement than it is the rest of the year. And I think about that too in the way like, you can pray in lots of different ways. But sometimes when I'm like, I really need to pray, I like turn off the lights and light a candle. And that makes it feel different. That it allows you to enter into something a little more holy this time that you need. Lots of studies have been done on ritual that across cultures and religions, having sort of these tangible ways to access that feeling of the holy pops up over and over again. And it's always involves like, oh, this physical object or this physical way of dressing or being changes how I feel so I can access some deeper emotion. And they tether that here in the Atonement Liturgy. It also brings release. One of the fun things Leviticus gives the English language is the word scapegoat. That in the liturgy, they bring a goat into the sanctuary. Everyone casts their sins onto the goat. Again, it's not really clear how to cast sins onto the goat. It just says to do it. And then after they cast the sins on the goat, they lead it out. And all of the sins have been taken away. And the new day is a new day, that everything starts fresh the next morning. So I think about this also with grief. And like, again, when I lost my dad, how communal grief was such a different thing than doing an offering. And, you know, talking to my brother and being like, God, he could be a real asshole sometimes, but I am going to miss him. And swapping the stories and being in the emotion with another person was so much more of a release than just feeling it on your own. The routine, his death date was November 18th. And there's something about having the anniversary that's like, oh, I'm going to remember my dad today. Not that I won't remember him other days, but I'm going to intentionally do this today. For ritual, I actually will pour a little scotch on my 18th, normally 2 glasses. And I'll sit and I'll light a candle and I'll tell my dad all the things he missed out on in the last year. And there's something about like the intentionality of being sad and leaning in and having the scotch that just like, this is the moment where I do the grief every year, not just one and done, but I'll come back and revisit it for the sake of healing this broken thing. And then normally I drink both glasses of scotch and cry a little, and that's where the release comes in. And then the next day, something new. But I wonder what like this would look like for COVID, to like gather as a community and ritualize the weird thing we all went through. To tell the stories and to find some way to capture that and release it. Like we don't live in a culture that pauses to capture and release or remember. I think that's really what atonement gets at, is that we need each other, we need the moment together, we need the moment of release, and we really lose something when we don't have it. Questions on that? Okay. The other big buzzword with Leviticus is purity, which is funny because it actually never shows up in Leviticus. The word impurity shows up a lot, but the spectrum that Leviticus has is impurity and holiness are sitting in together, not impurity and purity. And it's funny, when I wrote my paper, I went on Focus on the Family's website and looked at what they say on purity. And it's really just about abstinence. Like that's the entire page, is that to be pure, you have to wait to have sex until after you're married. Which Leviticus has something really different in mind. For one, there's two types of impurity. There's ritual impurity, that means you can't participate in the cultic life of the community. And then there's moral impurity, which has more of like a, you need to be in isolation for a while. Neither one is permanent, and there's really no judgment to either. It's a funny thing that impurity just kind of happens. For example, impurity is always tied to blood, certain foods, urine, semen, rashes, and dead bodies. And Leviticus acknowledges like, well, touching a dead body will make you impure, but somebody has to bury the dead body. So you'll be impure for a while. You shouldn't go in the temple. You shouldn't be around other people. But after a set waiting time, bathing time, and ritual, you can re-enter the communal life. And this just feels like a really healthy thing to me. I mean, we all went through a pandemic and know that being contagious is real. But there's also something about the like, I think of an example. The contagious aspect of purity with like a moral category. Do you ever walk in your neighborhood and you like come to an intersection and you can see the little cutaway in the grass where people have cut the corner and there's starting to be a little dirt trail that you no longer walk all the way to the corner? I think that's a little what Leviticus is getting at, is like, if we don't acknowledge we did something wrong, then everybody's just gonna follow what we did. And all of a sudden it's a slippery slope and a new path through the grass. And so I think Leviticus has this way of like, we need to call out this thing as harmful, but then we also need to have a way to be good again. And Leviticus offers both paths. Some of the stuff they call out, I have no idea why. I do think in this list of urine, semen, and blood, why is poop not impure? So it's not super logical. I do think a really beautiful pattern too is that often the waiting time and the bathing time adds up to about 8 days. And then on the 8th day, you can re-enter the society. So if you pair them in conversation with the creation story, Leviticus has this idea that after a period, you are a new creation and you get a new start, which is really different than how Focus on the Family talks about premarital sex. Question? Yes.
Just thinking about the bodily fluids that are named in Leviticus.
Yeah.
Is there a significant gender imbalance there? Is there more about women
Yeah.
being impure than men, or is that just a perception now?
I think that's probably fair. It seems like there's lots of different ways menstrual blood is scary. Like if it's on a sheet, you have to get rid of the sheet. If it's on a saddle, you have to get rid of the saddle. If it's on your clothes, you can clean your clothes. So there's like this odd discrepancy of like, no, that's extra bad. We need to like really deal with menstrual blood. I've seen some scholars who are like, well, maybe this is a benevolent thing that when you're menstruating, you have 8 days off. I don't know if that's just modern sensibility trying to make it seem nicer, or if that's true. The big thing for semen is like nocturnal emissions are forbidden. And so I think that's another case where people argue like, well, sometimes that just happens, just like menstruation just happens. But it doesn't seem to be nearly as condemned. I think the waiting period is 3 days instead of 8 days. So yeah, it feels, I don't know scientifically, but it feels like it's disproportionate. Yeah.
Can you expound on time to a new creation?
Yeah, so it's just a funny thing that this 8 number shows up, which shows up in other places in the Bible too. And so the idea being that if the creation narrative tells the creation story in 7 days, then the 8th day would be the start of a new week or the start of the next 7-day creation cycle.
I was going somewhere else with that. I was thinking, is this where some of your more conservative groups get the whole idea of a man should not like the man?
Oh, sure. No, I have a slide on that a little bit later. It is in the purity stuff. But yeah, not the new creation stuff. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Very things that they gave, and you know, I don't know what you can do now, when you take your, when that talks, or that's the top, you know, with that.
Yeah,
And I think some places, you know, people are not, and
sure. Yeah.
The most of that,
Yeah. When I chaperoned the youth this summer, Danielle gave me a little first aid kit, and I admittedly thought that the pad in it was like a really dry wet wipe. I'm like, well, this isn't really useful at all. And she had to explain it to me, so it is a crime that men learn very little about menstruation in our world. Other questions? Okay, this is my last big one. I talked fast even for me. Maybe? Oh, there we go. So the last big one that I picked out was Jubilee. And I caught this in my first week of Holy Spirit, that we sing about Jubilee during our offertory hymn every week. This comes from Leviticus 25, that every 50th year should be a year of Jubilee. And in the year of Jubilee, you should forgive all debts owed to you, free all slaves in your household, return any land that you've taken, and let the land rest for a year without planting or harvesting. I never understand why people quote Leviticus in politics. They never quote Leviticus 25. Like, never makes it on a sign. But I think it's really fascinating, this connection of how we treat the land and how we treat those who owe us money and how we treat money and how we treat labor is all kind of tied up in this system that Leviticus is imagining that will be a more holy living. It's kind of like what you believe infiltrates your values all around. That it's not just like, oh, that's the religious stuff, but this is money. It all gets married together. Which brings me to some questions. Yes.
Has it ever been practiced in Judaism? Has it ever been practiced?
I think it depends on who you ask of what practice looks like. I don't know concretely. I think scholars debate that very question of, was there a time in the past when it was really practiced? Are there modifications of it that have been practiced, or is it an imagined past? I don't think there's consensus on it.
What was the lifespan at the time?
That's a good question. I've always just, like, I just read on this recently, actually, that they're saying it's a myth that the lifespan's getting longer, that like people have kind of always lived about the same amount of time, but more would die younger. So I'm not sure exactly. That's a good question, because 50 years feels like that could have been old back in that day.
Yeah, I don't know, 50 years was chosen, so it was.
Yeah.
You were always.
Yeah, oh, he didn't make it, we gotta start over. Yeah, yeah. When I do wonder, maybe that's a little bit of the sentiment of like, you've had this debt for a lifetime, let it go, or the 50 years, or maybe again, tethered to this new creation, fresh start idea. Other questions? Okay, well, if you want to chat with your partners, here are some questions for each topic. We have about 15 minutes, and I don't think you'd get through them all. But if something jumps out to you that was like, I want to revisit that, take the next like 10 minutes or so to chat, and then we'll regroup as a group. Well, the big question everyone always has when I talk about Leviticus is like, well, what about the Antics? Really, right. So the two verses are 18:22 and 20:13. So I put both verses are basically the same. I put it here in literal English. If you were to translate it word for word, it comes as, and with a man you shall not lie, the lying down of a woman, it is an abomination. Which is clear as mud if you read it. A couple things I think are useful to think about. This abomination word in Hebrew is tovah, which is not as punchy as the word abomination is in English. A good example is like, maybe you've been to Europe where sometimes friends greet each other with a kiss on the cheek. We would say that's very tovah in the US, that like, it's not something we do. It's totally a different custom. It's not for us. So it's not quite the same punch as it's an abomination. I think the grammar makes it really murky. And then a couple contextual things. Chapter 18 appears to be a list of family members you should not sleep with. So it seems to be going through, like if you were to paraphrase it, you shall not sleep with your mother, your brother's wife, your sister, your daughter, your son's wives, or any of the men in your family. Might be a way to paraphrase chapter 18, that this clause of like, and the men is added into a list of incestual relationships you shouldn't commit. Chapter 20 is a list of people you shouldn't rape in times of war. So similarly, it might be like, or any of the men. I'm not sure that's the greatest argument, but contextually it kind of lines up. One of my favorite things I read on this was apparently in the modern day Yom Kippur liturgy, they actually read chapter 18 along with the story of the unholy fire. And so this particular rabbi argued that the stories go together because in the story of unholy fire, you have two men who conspire to invade the inner sanctum and the holiest of holies parts of the tabernacle. And so it's two men conspiring to overpower God. And he sees this is saying two men should not conspire to commit the laying down of a woman. That it's basically condemning gang rape of teaming up to overpower someone sexually. And I think it's interesting to put the two next to each other and see like, is part of Leviticus worried about how power is wielded and responsibly or not? I don't think that's conclusive like anything else in Leviticus, but I think it's an interesting extra theme that might emerge if you read the two stories side by side. So isn't Leviticus fun? Well, thank you guys.